professor, physician, epidemiologist. I am Dr. Sri Banerjee. Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Sri Banerjee, core faculty for the College of Health Sciences and Public Policy at Walden University, and with a joint appointment as faculty in Ross University School of Medicine. So it is with a great honor that I have been selected, and our group has been selected to present this topic in front of the 2022 International Conference on Emerging Infectious Diseases, being held between August 7th through 10th in Atlanta, Georgia, and remotely. So this is a joint effort between the Centers for Disease Control and the Task Force for Global Health. And I want to thank all of my collaborators, without whose help I would not have gotten to this point, and looking at gender disparities in outcomes from non-cancerous HPV infection. And some of my collaborators, of course, are Dean of part of Ross University School of Medicine, then some contributing faculty members, current students, former students, and graduates. So thank you for all the contributions. So just getting started with HPV cervical cancer. All of these things typically are synonymous, even though it's important to note that not all HPV translates to cervical cancer, although all cervical cancer, the etiology is HPV. So it claims 250,000 lives a year in adolescents and young adults. And if your body is able to successfully fight it off, then it's cleared within 2 years. The level of reactive oxygen species has been hypothesized to cause this disease from HPV. And what's interesting, I wanted to get into this a little bit. The endoplasmic reticulum is an important processing place for protein. But additionally, one of the roles that it has is a controller of how a protein is processed. And what HPV actually does is it causes the endoplasmic reticulum to malfunction. And so virus-associated factors have been associated with increased reactive oxygen species, and that is never good because that means there's free radicals, which can actually increase the frequency not only of cancer but also various chronic diseases and cause pathophysiology in cells. So non-cancerous HPV strains are often neglected, but they can cause papillomatosis. So this is something of concern. Warts typically disappear with the immune system. In the United States, 36,500 new cancer cases per year attributable to HPV. The mistaken over-identification of HPV as being female-specific, that is another myth that I want to bust by giving this talk, is that there's a feminization of HPV vaccines, that it is the responsibility of the female to get the HPV, when in fact certain HPVs may prove more detrimental to males, and I'm going to show you that in a second. So in this study, we wanted to determine, so because there's this feminization of this vaccine, we wanted to determine, is it true that public health campaigns need to be addressing only one gender over another? This is where this question came from, and actually we've been looking for this answer for years now, and so finally we're getting the chance to present our findings. But just a little bit about HPV. I mean, cervical cancer is only the tip of the iceberg, the metaphorical iceberg. There's cervical precancer, of course, and the earlier you can, of course, stage precancer and screen, the better the outcomes. Cervical cancer has gone down tremendously, but there's still gaps in service, and still the fact that the very fact that it still occurs even after all of the preventative measures, Gardasil, even after all of the screening, is alarming. But not only that, it's responsible for oropharyngeal cancer, anal cancer, vulvar and vagina cancer, and also penile cancer. So this is in figure 2, the geographic distribution of HPV vaccination rates. And as you can see, it varies. I mean, you go to Georgia and it's not as high, the vaccination coverage rates, as you see in Pennsylvania or New York. And Massachusetts usually is ahead of the curve in everything, and same goes with vaccination rates of adolescents in HPV. They're way ahead of the curve on that. The rest of the nation lags behind. Seems like North Dakota is also, and Maryland are ahead of the curve. So looking then now at some additional facts, of course, broader awareness, not only with the cancer-causing portion of cervical of HPV, but also non-cancer-causing consequences. That's something that's severely and grossly understudied. Viruses, the very fact that viruses exist are causing mutations within the genetic milieu of the organism, and many times this is fertile ground for other chronic diseases other than just cancer. And this is the broad idea that we're trying to promote and trying to understand post-COVID, the impact on the population. But anyway, this was looking at 10-year mortality outcomes of HPV. So how did we exactly do this? Simple. We went into NHANES survey, National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, and we looked at, and this is, of course, biannual survey that's done on non-institutional population. So you're not looking at the prison population or anybody else, but individuals that are greater than or equal to 20 years of age were included between the years of 1999 and 2008. The method that was used was a competitive Luminex immunoassay of antibodies to neutralizing epitopes on HPV 6. So this is important. 6, 11, 16, and 18 were the ones that were focused on. L1 virus-like particles, VLPs. Analysis was performed using Cox regression complex samples to determine how gender influences HPV-related outcomes. And all missing variables were excluded. SAS 9.4 was used for this. So this is going into a little bit more about HPV viruses. And another area, I did talk about reactive oxygen species. I did talk about kind of the role of the endoplasmic reticulum and how it's affected. But now, looking at how HPV affects histones. Histones are important because these are areas. So histones are an important area, and there's actually different types of histones. And histones are how DNA is tightly packed in proteins. And if these are affected, then which DNA is expressed and which DNA is suppressed, and the epigenetic expression of the genetic material is affected. And so I'm giving you multiple etiologies as to why HPV can not only cause cancer, but also chronic diseases otherwise, maybe cardiovascular disease and others. So this is why, of course, we're looking into this a little bit more. This is going into the whole genealogy, the phylogenetic tree of how all of the HPVs, and if you go in closer, this is a very, I know this is very difficult to see, but I actually marked with an arrow HPV 6 and 11. If you were to zoom in on this, you could see what part of the phylogenetic family tree the HPVs that we're looking at is belonging to. It's important to note that viruses go through ongoing genetic mutations, and this is how there's such a broad variety of phylogenetic outcomes. So this now the crude and adjusted hazard ratio of all-cause mortality. But note this is actually stratified by gender. So when we initially look at just HPV in general, HPV positive versus negative, of course, there is a 2.39 times likelihood of overall mortality. So that's there. 2.4 times likelihood of increased overall mortality. But now we were curious because, like I said earlier, there's this feminization of HPV vaccination uptake. So even though it may not cover all of the various vaccine strains or the non-cancer strains necessarily, but knowing what type of impact this has in males versus females helps us guide messaging and understanding this disease more. And as it turns out, this affects much more significantly males in terms of overall mortality than females. So hypothetically, on an epigenetic level, the way HPV affects males seems to be different than the way it affects females. Now, this has very significant implications. Let's go over the significant implications of these findings. So first of all, in a multi-ethnic population, we have just established specifically, and that was specifically looking at HPV-6. Males with HPV-6 demonstrated 119% increased mortality, and this was actually controlled for medical risk factors. So as male vaccination rates continue to lag behind female rates, this is important. Improved education and literacy efforts need to be tailored, need to be targeted towards counseling about the benefits of the vaccine. Through the collaboration, as I was talking with the Associate Dean at Ross, talking about improving vaccination rates, but also broadening coverage in the teenage population so that there could be better prevention. Global coverage, looking at that first dose of HPV vaccine, is only 15%. That is staggeringly low, despite the first vaccines being licensed over 15 years ago. So there is a true disconnect, and findings like these bring home the point that vaccinate, vaccinate, vaccinate. That is the public health message. Much progress in vaccination efforts just get lost. Also due to other ongoing pandemics like COVID-19. So let's not only broaden the exploration of the pathophysiological mechanisms of HPV, but also on a community level, let's see how we can target vaccination messaging, especially in areas with low coverage. This general model describes everything, connecting infectious diseases with chronic diseases and overall mortality. Thank you for listening. Now, I did want to continue with some bonus material here, just going into some of the various factors determining HPV and the connection with cervical cancer. Of course, there's a social connection, but also psychological. lifestyle, biomarkers. And actually, this model can be used to explain many different types of chronic diseases. But medical adherence and compliance. Now, in this situation, this would be vaccination compliance, if the vaccination was taken, biomarkers, and then, of course, morbidity. And depending on what the disease is, that morbidity or mortality would vary. So a cancerous HPV, that morbidity would be cancer. So another just bonus take-home message is county health rankings. Wonderful, wonderful resource to be using to try to have targeted vaccine uptake, make policy alterations, and school immunization mandatory in terms of cervical cancer, and then more research into epigenetic factors. And that concludes our presentation. Here's our references.